New Deal's impact minorities. Just a quick note, when looking at the New Deal's impact on minorities, gender minorities, as well as ethnic and racial minorities, it is going to be a little bit of a mixed bag. So first of all, women during this time period are going to gain increased attention and influence. But really, the government and society as a whole are going to remain largely bound by like traditional values. So it's a bit of a mixed impact when it comes to the New Deal on working women. Now, the formal government policy required equal consideration for women and men. But basically, local officials are going to flout this requirement so openly that Eleanor Roosevelt herself is going to try to step in and urge prominent New Dealers like Harry Hopkins to really impress on these state administrations that women's programs were just as important as men's. The other issue is when you do get relief programs for women, basically they would restrict women to so-called women's work regardless of what skills they had. So it'd be very much like, oh, women are supposed to sew. And so it didn't matter if they might have a skill in a different industry. That's what they were allowed to do when they were on a relief program under the New Deal. Also, women were paid scarcely half what men received in these relief programs. And all of this is reinforcing those traditional ideas of women's work. Even though there were demands by different women's leagues for equal pay and equal work regardless of sex. But still, like, the NRA codes are going to mandate like lower wage scales for women and justify it on, oh, these are long established customs. But I should point out the fact that the New Deal is going to raise the minimum wage is going to help women out overall, because even though they're being paid a lot of times minimum wage, increasing that bottom pay is going to help them. We're going to see things like the Social Security Act didn't cover certain like women's jobs often, like domestic servants, waitresses, women who are working from the home. And so this is once again reinforcing all those notions about like what is the proper role for men versus the proper role for women. And in fact, a lot of times with this idea that men are supposed to be the wage owners and women staying at home as wives and mothers, this means that basically if women did work outside the home, but so did their husband, and he was eligible for benefits, then automatically she wouldn't receive like a retirement pension. Still, women are going to gain some political influence under the New Deal, but most of the time it's going to be individuals rather than women as a whole. So it'd be things like the first woman cabinet member is going to be the Secretary of Labor, Frances Perkins. And then, of course, you have to look at Eleanor Roosevelt herself. She was a big advocate for women's rights. She demanded reforms publicly. She traveled across the nation. She would write newspaper columns. She'd speak openly on the radio, and actually so much so that there was a lot of criticism towards FDR saying, hey, you need to do something about your wife. And his response always to that was, and I quote, well, that's my wife. I can't do anything about her. We also are going to see the New Deal's record on racial issues is limited. Personally, FDR did deplore racial abuses, but he was very aware that the core part of the Democratic Party up to this point had always been white Southerners. And so because of that, FDR never pushes really for civil rights legislation, fearing to antagonize that core group. And so we see a lot of programs in the New Deal are going to discriminate against African Americans. It'll be things like the CCC would segregate out black workers. You can see how African Americans felt about like the NRA, and that the black press would call it the Negro runaround or Negroes ruined again. But that being said, poor and unemployed African Americans are going to benefit from like the welfare and economic programs of the New Deal, and things like increasing minimum wage that helps African Americans. We're going to see key New Dealers are going to campaign against racial discrimination. Eleanor Roosevelt, she is going to constantly prod FDR to like appoint Black officials. And she also wrote articles trying to be a voice for the African American community. She also flouted segregationist laws. She was extremely popular in the Black community. And it wasn't just her, it was other prominent New Dealers like Harry Hopkins and Harold Eichels that promoted equal rights. And African Americans themselves are going to press for reforms. And we are going to see over time, FDR does take a bit more of an interest in Black economic and social problems. And so we get things like, with the second New Deal, they would prohibit discrimination in the WPA in 1935. And the NYA also adopted enlightened racial policies. FDR also appoints Black people into really important positions, like you get the first Black federal judge under FDR. And so in this way, the New Deal is going to improve economic and social conditions for a lot of African Americans. Things like illiteracy rates are going to drop in the African American community. So we're seeing more literacy. The number of Black college students and graduates is going to more than double during this time period. And then, of course, things like relief and public health programs reduce like Black infant mortality rates and raise life expectancy rates. So the thing is, discrimination, yes, it is going to persist, but a lot of African Americans were helped. We also have to look at other racial minorities like Native Americans. They're also going to benefit from the New Deal. It's things like some Native Americans are going to join in the CCC. A lot of times this appealed to their interests and skills. We're also going to see a refocusing of government Indian policy during this time. So before this point, government Indian policy had always, undermined tribal authority and promoted assimilation and reduced land holdings amongst Native Americans and attacked their culture. But now Congress is going to pass the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which actually was known as the Indians' New Deal. It's going to guarantee for Native Americans religious freedom, reestablish tribal self-government, halts the sale of tribal lands, and would actually give funds to basically transfer land holdings back to Native Americans. Of course, it wasn't like a large amount of land holdings, but it was at least some. They would support like Native American students or Native American businesses and such. But unfortunately, this was seen as really controversial because some didn't like it. They felt like it was communistic and atheistic. And others, like Native Americans themselves, wanted more. Okay, so you give us back some land, but keep in mind how much has been taken from the Native Americans leading up to this point. And so a lot of Native Americans were offended by it also because they felt like they were stereotyped still.